the last benchmark video, we had a look at rotational acceleration. And in order to figure that out, we just calculated that based on the numbers of the gyro trace, in where we assumed kind of the peak acceleration is. Since then, I've hacked the Betaflight BlackBox log viewer to actually calculate the angular acceleration for us. So check below, you can get download a copy of that from my GitHub that has this, and I just added an additional graph type, angular acceleration, where you can add for roll, pitch, and yaw with all of the usual stuff that what we're seeing here on the bottom shows us the instantaneous acceleration at any point along the graph. So if you want to check this stuff out for yourself, you can go ahead and grab that and really easily take a look at your logs and see what sort of rotation rates are hitting. Some interesting things that I found, though, looking back at the previous logs with this, our peak acceleration is basically right where we had a look at it, around about 700 degrees here at the peak, and I'm pulling 2300 degrees a second. But interesting, you'll see that, and we have the same results for all of these fast moves, that we never actually peak out on our acceleration. These moves happen over such a short range of time, even though we're going nearly 1,000 degrees a second from a standstill. We actually don't have enough time to reach our full acceleration. We're still accelerating right up until the point where the PID controller shuts us down, and then we start slowing down again. So you can kind of get an even clearer image of what sort of force the motor is applying on the quad here, where the gyro trace isn't as obvious with it, but here you can see that the motor is still, all through this entire thing, it's still accelerating. So we're not getting anywhere close to what our motor graph is, what we're asking the motor to do. You know, we peg it up to full and are holding it at full throttle. We never actually get to full throttle thrust through this. The motor is still accelerating all through this, from the standstill, all through this range. And while I haven't really formally done any motor response speed tests yet to compare any of these, the sort of numbers that I was seeing in early results is can take actually a couple hundred milliseconds for a motor to spin up from idle speed up to full 100% of its spinning speed. You'll get to about 80% fairly quickly in 80 or 90 milliseconds, but then the motor takes a lot longer to get the last little bit. And the amount of time kind of between here, if we assume that this right here is right where we start increasing the motor speed, and when we actually see that starting to really pick up in our acceleration graph, this ends up being about 30 or 40 milliseconds, which is still way smaller than a dead stop full. We would probably need to at least double our requested rotational speed, maybe 2,000, 3,000 degrees a second, before, at least with this build, we might actually see the sustained full thrust from the motors in a fast roll move like this. And also, if I pop over to this one, you can really clearly see the kind of the impulse that we get, our change in rotational speed, versus here we had kind of a really funky motor graph at the very beginning where it dialed back and then peaked again. And of course, because the motor never actually hits this, we get a more muted response there in the beginning. We never really peak up and fall back the same way that our motors we're asking our motors to do, just because of the momentum. And also interesting here, if we compare the pure idle, kind of where the beginning of the motor moves to where we start really seeing the acceleration pickup, that's again about 40-50 milliseconds, something like that. But if we look here at where this second peaky impulse comes from, where we had just been slowing down the motors, the PID controller's asking for less, and then suddenly spikes the motors again. The motors have come up a good way, probably about half power there. And the difference between here, where we start asking for more power, and where we actually see it there, is a lot less. That ends up being only like 12 or 15 milliseconds or something like that until we actually start to see this second impulse come. So it's certainly not a flat, you're not seeing a flat delay there, whether this is from momentum that the motor has been able to build up from going to essentially half throttle there. And it's able to capitalize on that to accelerate and have faster response in there. The second half of its RPM range, or if the motor is just giving us more better responsiveness in the higher side of its RPM band, or whether this may be an effect that we only will see in the air because of prop unloading or something to that effect. I'm not really sure. So that's definitely something that we'll want to explore a little more thoroughly when we start doing motor response time tests eventually.